Hi, I'm Professor Stephen Resnikoff. I teach at the DePaul College of Law, and I serve as the director of its Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies, JLJS. At the outset, I want to thank all of the members of JLJS's advisory board. I believe that both of its chairs, Mark Basowitz and David Levitt, as well as a couple of its members, Phil Stern and perhaps Patty Ray, are with us today. And I also want to thank all the members of the JLJS Academic Advisory Board, especially Professor Ellen Cannon, whom I saw on the registration list, for all the support and advice that they provide. And each of these people actually promote or combat anti-Semitism, promote Zionism in their own ways and many other of their own ways outside of JLJS. JLJS is the sponsor of today's program, which focuses on the weaponization of sexual atrocities in Israel on and after the horrific events of October 7, 2023. Those of you who registered in advance should have received an email from me early this morning, providing them with links to substantial materials pertaining to this topic. We're privileged to have with us today two extremely accomplished scholars, Professor Dr. Amy Elman and Professor Dr. Emerita Phyllis Chesler. We plan to proceed in 4 steps. First, I'm going to briefly describe Professors Elman and Chesler in the order in which they will speak. Second, I will share about 5 to 6 minutes of a video clip regarding the sexual atrocities of October 7th. Third, I will ask Professor Elman to speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, after which I will ask Professor Chesler to do the same. And then finally, fourth, I'll put questions to the two speakers so that they can answer or discuss them. I'd ask you, everyone in the audience, to please send me via chat any questions that you have, or Q&A. I see there's a Q&A tab as well, so either one. That you have as the program proceeds, that I can draw on your questions during the Q&A session. First, an introduction to the speakers. So Dr. Amy Elman, Professor of Political Science and the holder of the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College. Professor Elman, who's a dear friend, has received numerous awards for her scholarship, including 2 Fulbright grants, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Mellon sabbatical grant, a grant from the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Hebrew University, and others. She has written 4 books, the most recent being The European Union, Anti-Semitism, and the Politics of Denial. Her 2 most recent peer-reviewed articles are The Mainstreaming of American Anti-Semitism, The Defeat of an Ideal, and October 7, Passionate Anti-Zionists, Pornography, and Feminist Impersonators. The second speaker is Dr. Phyllis Chesler, Professor Emerita of City University of New York. A prolific writer, Professor Emerita Chesler has authored 20 books, including Women and Madness, An American Bride in Kabul, and A Politically Incorrect Feminist. She's the co-founder of the Association for Women in Psychology and of the National Women's Health Network. Her recent work focuses on anti-Semitism/anti-Zionism, jihad terrorism, Islamic gender and religious apartheid, and honor killing. And just today I saw Dr. Chesler's review of Daniel Pipes' brand new book, I think it was published on June 5th, entitled Israel Victory, How Zionists Win Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberation. We're really quite fortunate to have these 2 distinguished speakers with us. And now I'm just going to show you the video clip.
Nearly 2 months after the October 7th attacks, the international community is finally beginning to investigate and recognize reports of brutal and inhumane rapes and sexual assaults by Hamas terrorists, torturing and terrorizing the people of Israel. For weeks, Israeli police have been collecting eyewitness testimony, video, and forensic evidence detailing countless accounts of rape and sexual assault perpetrated by terrorists on Israeli women and children. And for weeks, there has been very little outcry or condemnation from the international community. including from the United Nations.
Sadly, the very international bodies that are supposedly the defenders of all women showed that when it comes to Israelis, indifference is acceptable. To these organizations, Israeli women are not women. The rape of Israelis is not an act of rape. Their silence has been deafening.
But Monday, the United Nations held a gathering hosted by Israel, examining sexual and gender-based violence committed during Hamas's attack on Israel. Hamas has denied committing any rapes or sexual assaults.
There are exactly no circumstances that justify rape. None. Rape is targeted. Rape is terror. Rape is torture.
Doesn't just strike fear in the hearts of Israeli women, it strikes fear in the hearts of every woman and girl around the globe. Their bodies are not just defenders.
The chief superintendent of the Israeli police read numerous accounts of the atrocities witnessed by survivors and first responders.
Everything was an apocalypse of corpses. Girls without any clothes on, without tops, without underwear. People cut in half, butchered. Some were beheaded. There were girls with a broken pelvis due to repetitive rapes. Their legs were spread wide apart in a split. A police officer testified, "I couldn't drive because there was a baby cradle full of blood on the road. A baby that was outside his cradle and a naked woman lying next to the baby's body. She was naked, badly injured, bullets in her body." A witness from the rave party testified, "We heard girls that were pulled out from the shelters, girls that shouted. They raped girls, burned them just after that. All the bodies outside were burned." A rescuer that arrived to a house on a kibbutz testified, "Inside the shower, there was a body of a cuffed woman. She was without her underwear. The body was in the corner, and her hands were tied." Another testimony from the rave party survivor. Women without clothes. Some without the upper body clothes. Some without the lower body clothes. Blood over the lower body. Everyone was full of blood. Butchered people. We found a woman's body dumped outside, without pants, without underpants, burned, barely any hair left on her.
And videos were played from a first responder, a paramedic, and a survivor of the music festival, detailing firsthand what they experienced.
The two we had were bound by their hands. Their hands were behind their back. There was a body of a woman that had a blood stain on her genitalia. There was a lot of gun wounds there. Shooting was targeted at sexual organs. We saw that a lot. They had a thing with sexual organs, both in women and in men. The women we received, they were civilian. We mainly saw either breast amputations or gunshots just to the breast, simply shooting from one side of the breast to the other. They were conscious when they got to us. They laid a woman down, and I understand that he's raping her. He's basically shifting her position, and then they pass her on to another person. Was she alive, the girl they raped? Yes, she was alive. She had long hair. He was pulling her hair. She's not dressed, and he cuts her breast. He throws it on the road, and they're playing with it.
Another survivor of the attack describes seeing a horrific rape at the Nova Music Festival to London's Sunday Times. "I saw this beautiful woman with the face of an angel, and 8 or 10 of the fighters beating and raping her. She was screaming, 'Stop it already. I'm going to die anyway from what you're doing. Just kill me.' When they finished, they were laughing. and the last one shot her in the head.
Do we believe the Hamas spokesperson who said that rape is forbidden, therefore it couldn't have possibly happened on October 7th? Or do we believe the women whose bodies tell us how they spent the last minutes of their lives? Who are we going to believe?
Oh.
Shall I begin, Steve?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Do you hear me now?
I do.
Yeah, but you're
Okay,
very
I'm
low.
Low?
Yeah.
So, well, okay. I just wanted to say that was the video that I wanted to, and it's a link to that is included in the many links about videos in the email that I sent out. So we want to start with asking Professor Elman to make a direct presentation of about 15, 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin by extending my gratitude to Professor Resnikoff and to the members of the JLJS program and to all of you in attendance. My presentation has 3 parts. The first part was going to be a description. I'll cut that substantially following this film because I think it did such a fine job. After that, I want to touch upon a brief discussion of Hamas and the context within which rape denial is now taking place, such that we have the continued weaponization of sex. And I want to talk about that to really better grasp the war against Jews. So let me begin. How to follow the kind of film that we saw. I would add to that we have as much material as we do because captured terrorists actually acknowledged not only their abuse, but the fact that it was intentional. So I would add to that enacted as a weapon of war, those men systematically perpetrated sexual abuse. And it's important that we realize that they did so in each zone of the massacre. I would also add to the description before I get going with a lot of the analysis pertaining to it, that the premeditated character of that sexual abuse was evidenced in many things, but in particular, a dead terrorist's notebook that contained a translation key. And in Hebrew, that translation key read, "Take off your pants." And just those 4 words help to account for the piles and piles of bloody corpses naked below the waist. In sync with both the tenor and technology of our times, the terrorists posted selfies of their exploits from their own cell phones and the cell phones of their victims, as well as body cameras. And they posted those videos to their own relatives, to a larger public, and to the devastation of the Jewish world and the friends and families of their victims. I would add that Hamas's behavior was reminiscent of the Serbian fascists who used rape and the pornography that they've made of it as a public spectacle to induce women and others to leave their homes and never return. That one set of perpetrators raped for Serbia and another to free Palestine does not mean that the rape was then, or that it is now, the perpetrator's only tool, or that women and girls were their only victims. Hamas forced Israeli hostages, including a young boy of just 12 years old, to repeatedly watch the pornography that they produced of October 7th, and held alone for 6 weeks Hamas told this boy that his kibbutz and that Israel no longer existed. Now, for those who remain in custody, it's likely that the sexual torture continues. They're living in slavery. And for those who were freed, the road to recovery is likely to be very long and uncertain. That Hamas's sadism is often hailed as resistance testifies both to the depth of anti-Semitism and to the normalization of the sexual abuse that accompanies it. And so now I want to talk about contexts. Having just briefly described what Hamas did, and we had the film as a segue, I'd like to turn to who they are and the foundational texts that inspire them. So, founded in 1987, Hamas is the acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, and it has been officially designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, Israel, and all of the 27 member states of the European Union. Hamas's initial 1988 charter calls upon Muslims, and it does so explicitly, it calls upon Muslims to murder Jews for having ostensibly usurped Palestinian land. And while women in 1988 were permitted to fight the enemy, their primary role was really as mothers, or in the words of the charter, as a maker of men. In adopting a revised charter in 2017, a charter that came on the heels of the 10th anniversary of the ruling of Hamas's ruling of Gaza, Hamas declared that its conflict, this is in the charter, its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with Jews because of their religion. And hence, it directs its ire against what it refers to as the racist, aggressive, colonial, and expansionist Zionist project of Israel by all means and methods, or as they say on the streets, by any means necessary. So what's shifted was not then the ambition to obliterate the only Jewish state and her people. What's changed is the rhetoric and its reliance on women. The revised charter of 2017 states that Muslim women are to play a pivotal role in the project of resistance, liberation, and the building of a political system. So this pivot to a seemingly more restrained rhetoric and a more active role for women likely stems from a very hard-nosed calculation about how to best accomplish Israel's end. Devorah Margolin explains that from 1993 to 2000, Israel was able to preempt 30% of suicide bombing men. That's significant. So in her analysis, Palestinian women were able to have a greater freedom of movement and access to potential targets. And in this climate, she reasoned, Palestinian groups, including Hamas, were aware of women's strategic and operational advantages, and they leveraged women to circumvent detection and carry out attacks. Again, they used women to circumvent detection and carry out attacks. I think that those tactical benefits extend no less now to the cognitive war that's waged by women against Israel. That, in summary, is my core bit of analysis. Hamas's effective weaponization of sexual atrocities depends as much on the barbarity of its male perpetrators as it does on the unrelenting audacity of its women supporters. And for that reason, one should never underestimate their trivialization of October 7th and their ability, and it's been significant, to cast doubt that the crimes of that day even occurred. I say this because as women, they are far better placed to silence and cast aspersions on survivors while simultaneously evading charges of sexism. And their feigned incredulity toward survivors is nothing short of pernicious, because like Holocaust deniers, they dispute the direct testimonies of Jews and the forensic evidence that those survivors provide, and corpses as well. They refer to all of that as malicious lies. So with the Holocaust and October 7th emblematic of evil, these deniers have furthered anti-Semitism by convincing folks that the crimes for which Jew hating can be blamed never happened. Just to give you a recent example, you should consider the Hebrew University professor given front page coverage by the New York Times, who declared, if it meaning the rapes, if it didn't happen, it's shame on the state. And then she claimed Israel was, quote, using women's bodies and sexuality to promote political agendas. To what end? In this professor's mind, to endorse the further dispossession and killing of Palestinians. What's her solution to the state's alleged deceit? Quote, abolish Zionism, right? Completely consistent with the charters. When the university suspended the professor, stating that it's not possible to teach social work while declaring that rape didn't happen, she claimed that she hadn't denied the rapes. And in fact, she hadn't. She simply implied that they may not have happened, and that, quote, as a feminist, she believes all victims, a position that echoed the avalanche of denials from countless academics and activists in the United States as well. What's interesting is also that although Hebrew University reinstated her, the New York Times, in its front page coverage, nonetheless characterized Israel as repressive. Ignoring her sophistry, this woman's sophistry, its journalists then scolded the country's academic institutions for inhibiting free speech and academic freedom. That article was entitled, "A Palestinian Professor Spoke Out Against the War in Gaza." And that story focused on the cycle of persecution that this professor endured. And then it noted that the United Nations was, quote, unable to independently verify that the rape allegations that Hamas denies happened. My argument is that rape and its apparent plausible deniability serve Hamas's long game, which is to obliterate the authority of Israel to defend itself and its people. And as Anat-Vil notes, the state of Israel was born not after the Holocaust, so that never again. The state of Israel was intended to be born by the Zionist leaders before the Holocaust, so that never at all. So frustrated by the protection that Israel has long provided its citizens and diasporic Jews, anti-Semites have placed the Jewish state in their crosshairs. And given that all states are, including Israel, states are defined by their monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a given territory, a full-out military victory, and Phyllis notes this in her review of our colleagues' work, a full-out military victory isn't required by terrorists to win their war against Israel's legitimacy. Currying favor on college campuses and in the court of international opinion is sufficient to inflict considerable damage. And in an age of 24/7 misinformation, pornographic rage, and the subsequent normalization of sexual abuse, the sexual assault and intimidation, that those have become an essential weapon of choice among our enemies, makes a lot of sense. More recently, one need only consider Paris, where 2 boys between the ages of 13 and 14 raped a 12-year-old girl for being Jewish. We're talking about transnational war. And again this summer, well, going back to 2021 and again this summer, British jihadists were demanding the rape of Jewish mothers and Jewish daughters from the streets of London, where these women live. And closer to home, over a week ago, in New York City, protesters raged against an exhibit that honored those raped and slaughtered by Hamas at the Nova Dance Festival. Insisting that October 7th was Zionist propaganda, they nonetheless flew Hamas flags and carried banners that declared, "Long live October 7th." And another one of those banners stated, quote, "The Zionists are not Jews and not humans." I'd like to conclude by noting that Israel is less a gender-neutral collective Jew among nations than a woman who's unentitled to the possession of her own body in a hostile neighborhood and is thus brutally assaulted. Witnessing the attack from a safe distance, what onlookers do is they engage in victim blaming and declare Israel was provocative, that she had it coming, that she asked for it. And dependent on seemingly chivalrous others, she is reprimanded for defending herself. She's expected, actually, to identify with those who seek to destroy her, and her submission would seem to allow everyone to just get along. Besides, expecting perpetrators to behave any differently seems unfair and impossible because we are told repeatedly, boys will be boys. Her crime, Israel's crime, is her existence. That seemingly reasonable people ask whether she has a, quote, right to exist, suggests the implied conclusion that she lacks the humanity necessary to do so. And I bring this dynamic of sexism to your attention and the weaponization of sexual assault. In closing, not because I think it's impossible to change course. Rather, I'm arguing it is possible to change course only when we can more deeply grasp the grotesque sexual dimensions of the war that's now being waged not only against Jews and not only against Israel, but women and humanity worldwide. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to hearing the great insights of my dear colleague, Phyllis Chesler.
Thank you very much, Amy. But just let me remind everybody to please put in the chat or the Q&A any questions that you may have for either of the speakers or for both. So I'll have them when we get to the Q&A. Phyllis, could you please join us?
Okay, let me make an off-the-cuff remark. I think it's dangerous to show the 10/7 footage because the sight of Jewish blood, Jews rendered dead and vulnerable, unleashes a lust for more Jewish blood. And so I've had very, very mixed feelings about the showings of the 47 or 48 minutes at 3 times at Davos, once perhaps at the UN, and so on. We have to think about the dangers of viewing, as Amy pointed out. It's a form of pornography, of sadistic pornography. And the more you show it, the more it incites others to repeat it. And it normalizes it. This is the danger of actually showing us the evidence. What happened on 10/7 was unspeakable, but it was not unique. It was a pogrom, but on steroids, with a lot of techie stuff. And it was one in which the pogromists recorded and photographed themselves. And public gang rape, repeated, and torture and murder are all part of a classic pogrom. And it didn't just happen to women. Boys and men were also genitally mutilated, sexually tortured, kidnapped, and murdered. And this is an important point, especially in an Arab or Muslim society, which are renowned for boy love. And we do not as yet have the story of what's happened to the Israeli male hostages. Now, rape used to be a spoil of war, but then it became a systematic weapon of war, and its purpose was to ethnically cleanse a particular population. It became understood as a war crime. Of course, rape goes on globally every minute, and one wonders, why is that not a war crime and treated as such, nor is it treated as a hate crime, which it should be. It took place in Bangladesh in 1971, all over North Africa, and in the former Yugoslavia, as my dear colleague Amy pointed out, in Rwanda, in South Sudan, where it continues. And the New York Times, by the way, talks about gunmen and doesn't clarify that this is mainly the old Janjaweed comeback, and it's essentially ethnic Arab Muslims who are raping more or less African Black Christians because they disguise all this. It also took place to the Yazidis in Iraq at the hands of ISIS. It's taken place over the years in South America as well. What is utterly unique is the utter silence among Western so-called progressive regressives, feminists who claim to care about violence against women. And even though not all the victims were Israeli citizens or Jews, no one cared about anyone else. And in fact, our president, Mr. Biden, has not yet rescued any American hostages. And there are, I think, 9. Now, I was not surprised, disgusted, yes, but not surprised by what I'm calling the great American feminist silence after 10/7, because I've been dealing with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism on the left among feminists since 1971. I convened panels and press conferences. I obtained signatures against the UN resolution equating Zionism with racism. I stood outside the synagogues in France, Italy, and Austria, guarded by police after they'd been bombed by Palestinian terrorists. And I did all that I could to warn Jews and Israelis about the well-funded and pernicious cognitive war that, in my opinion, then and now, would utterly determine the boots on the ground war. And no one cared. No one paid attention. The indifference and the arrogance and the lack of prescience was beyond belief. I did not become a professional Jew in any sense. I continued doing pioneering feminist work until the Intifada of 2000. And then I knew that the bloody beast, and I knew it in my bones, was back, and that the Jews and the West were facing Islamic Jew hatred, as well as the red-green alliance of Marxist crazies and long-time Islamic Jew hatred. And this was denied, as well as perpetrated by Western professors, the intelligentsia, the media, Nobel Prize winners, governments, and international organizations, which continue to do so. And when I published my first book on the subject of anti-Semitism in 2003, I could barely get it reviewed. I was denounced as a traitor to feminist and progressive causes. I was early on disinvited, canceled, censored, and I had to face potential riots. And I needed police protection on campuses. I had been a professor for 30 years. It was unbelievable. And then, which explains the feminist silence, I published a book called The Death of Feminism in 2005, which is, of course, now out of print. And I focused on how Western feminists had become more obsessed with the alleged occupation of a country that has never existed, Palestine, than with the real occupation of women's bodies in Gaza and on the West Bank, who were being forced into hijab, niqab, child and arranged marriages, or who were being honor killed by their families for minor or imagined infractions. Honor killing is a form of femicide. It's primarily a Muslim on Muslim crime, both in the West and in Muslim countries. I did a study showing that it does take place among Hindus in India, but only in India. The Hindus who come to the West do not bring that with them, perhaps didn't practice it in India either, and to a much lesser extent among Sikhs. And guess what? Women collaborate in honor killing. They conspire. They insist that their menfolk take action against the hussy, the one who wants an independent life, or who falsely has been denounced as talking to a boy, or wanting to marry someone who's not a Muslim, or refuses to accept an arranged marriage. So I was not surprised by the feminist silence, and for another reason. In the academic world, you're either a victim or a victimizer. You're oppressed or you're an oppressor. You're colonized or you're colonized, or you're a colonizer. And some victims are more sacred than others. Men of color are more important than white men. Muslim men of color are even more important unless they've been killed by other Muslims, in which case no one really cares. If they were killed, even in self-defense, by an Israeli, well, then they become the most important, and certainly far more important than anything that ever happens to women. And the Feminist Academy has signed on to all this. Then add to that the academic belief in multicultural relativism, that all cultures are equal, no such thing as barbarism, who are we to judge? We're the major sinners in the West, and that there's also no such thing as objective truth. Everything is relative. Everyone's entitled to their own narrative. So we have joint delusions ongoing, that men really can become women, that women can become men, and that Palestine, a country that has no history, no archaeology, not even any specific cuisine, although they claim otherwise, that they are the most important, the most sacred, and the most innocent of countries on earth, even when they're placing tunnels filled with armaments under schools, UN schools, mosques, hospitals. Now, it's a cult. This is a cult. And I'm not saying that now people don't think. In the past, people thought that those people living in Israel or in Yehuda and Shomron, they thought they were Syrians. They thought they were Egyptians. They didn't have a national concept of being Palestinians. This is a very recent ruse which allows the fight, the Iranian fight, the Islamic fight against a Jewish presence, a sovereign Jewish presence. Well, after 10/7, I was a cognitive warrior on fire. I wrote about 30 articles, and I sent them to feminist allies who didn't respond, or in one or two instances said that they would get on it. But they didn't, not for 2 or 2.5 months. And none of this should surprise us. One feminist ally actually sent me the works of Masha Gessen and Judith Butler and said that I was deluded not to understand that Jews were far more morally superior and ethical in Galut, in the diaspora, than they were now, since they're a Nazi apartheid, what are the other words? Nazi apartheid nation state, a colonial power, a white colonial power, so that the Jews in Israel are being scapegoated for the crimes that Muslims commit. Muslims are the largest practitioners of gender and religious apartheid. Not all Muslims. There are so many Muslims with whom I work and who are dissidents and who have to flee their country of origin and come to the West. We don't get many Westerners going to live in Afghanistan, do we? Or in Saudi Arabia, despite some improvements lately. And as 10/7, as Amy has pointed out, reminded us, as 10/7 was ongoing, there were people marching in the streets of my city, in the streets of all American cities, in the cities across Europe, for Palestine, for Hamas, for barbarism, queers for Palestine. And they were creating an auditory nightmare with their multiple drummers and multiple whistleblowers and multiple megaphone users. And they were chanting incessantly and walk kafirs, and they shut down bridges and tunnels. This is the Intifada gone global. This is jihad globalized, and it is everywhere in the interstices of every faculty, academic faculty that wants to disinvite an Israeli academic. I mean, the examples, it's like a virus has suddenly, the poisoned fruit of 50 to 60 years of well-funded propaganda against Jews and against Israel has paid off. And as Amy also pointed out, we, or not you and I perhaps, but the underestimating of our enemy was dangerous, just as not understanding what was about to happen on 10/7 was beyond belief. I don't have the answer to why this happened. And one of the reasons my views are different, I'm looking at the time, is because I once lived in a Muslim country and I've worked with Muslims, both religious Muslims, ex-Muslims, dissident Muslims, and most Westerners have no idea of what Islam is about, what it's like. They don't know that Islam practiced imperialism, colonialism, conversion via the sword, no understanding that Muslims practice slavery, still do, anti-Black slavery and sex slavery. And they don't want to know, and they don't want to learn. And it's very hard. My first near riot, which took place at a freestanding conference at Barnard in 2003, was when I was asked a question by an agent provocateur. Where do you stand on the question of the women of Palestine? And I could have said, oh, I'm lighting candles for them, I'm praying for them. What I said, I think you're asking me where I stand on the issue of apartheid, and I oppose it. And Islam is the largest practitioner of religious and gender apartheid. Place went crazy. These were mainly all Black women, African-American women, who had invited me as their beloved professor on the subject of my 10th book, Woman's Inhumanity to Woman. Yes, women can be sexist, and women are highly competitive with each other. And they kept saying, what about the humiliation at the checkpoint? And I said, well, not good. It's a war zone, but you know, how about being genitally mutilated or honor killed by your family? Let's get a grip. They couldn't get a grip. I had to be hustled out for my safety. Even now, as the chicks up front for barbarism all across the West, they're putting on hijab. They're putting on hijab even as the Iranian government continues jailing, torturing, and murdering Iranian women whose hijabs have slipped or gone missing. But there's an Iranian election now where 5 of the very conservative mullahs running have said, well, you know, come to think of it, we've been punishing the women on this issue too harshly. Well, I hope they stop doing that. And by the way, the chicks up front, the Westerners who are the heirs of Western Enlightenment values and post-Enlightenment values and feminist ideas, they're not talking about the right to abortion. They're not talking about sex slavery or sexual harassment or woman battering. No, they're just talking about Palestine and the evil of Israel. These are the so-called freedom fighting feminists. So we have lost whatever was good about feminist potential, at least at this time. And the demonstrators are, as everyone knows, they're so funded, deeply funded by Iran, by Qatar, by versions of the Muslim Brotherhood, Students for Justice in Palestine, Soros and his ilk. This is the Red-Green Alliance, and this will bring down the West if we can't turn it around. Let me get to, and yes, I confronted many feminists, and there are many who I don't talk to anymore, and one who I'm continuing the conversation with. And many feminists, cleverly, Democratic Party feminists in America, published 2.5 months after 10/7, holding other feminists accountable for not having said anything sooner, as if they were not among them. It's a very, very neat trick. And I don't want to go into it, it's too detailed, but the eventual letters, the open letters, are a marvel to behold because they're so repugnantly even-handed and are so afraid just to stand for Israel or for truth. They have to also stand for the imagined famine that Israel has inflicted on Gazans, which is not true. And let me say that we all know that the Jews are once again under siege, under profound siege. And the world demonizes Israel for daring to defend herself. And like so many, I had assumed wrongly that the world's hatred and persecution of Jews had kind of ended and that Jewish history wouldn't repeat itself again. Well, I was wrong. I was dead wrong. And now so many American Jews and Israeli Jews are waking up as if for the first time. What do we do? What's happened? What does this mean? Where do we go? We're in the midst of a slow motion Holocaust, or we're trapped in a real life horror movie. There are multiple simultaneous intifadas. Arab terrorists attacked Israel from the moment of her birth and before then, of course. And the human homicide bombers and the stabbers and the car rammers and an endless rain of rockets from Gaza, and now from Hezbollah on the north, from Lebanon. Again, proxies like the Houthis, Iranian proxies. When will America finally understand that Iran has America and the West in its crosshairs? When will Europe act on this understanding? It's really, and we have, because of technology, medieval style blood libels that are being recycled in every language 24/7 on the internet. How do we stop that? How do we combat it? I mean, yes, and one of the is that we're perpetrating a genocide on the Palestinians. I said that anti-Zionism was the new anti-Semitism, and I took great heat for it. I'm glad, or not so glad, to see that now everyone else is getting that, but a quarter of a century later. So my conclusion, we have to shed our illusions permanently. We cannot believe or expect that conditions will always improve, or that one country or another will always be a safe haven for Jews. We have repeated our history too many times. Mainly, one cannot win a war of ideas if one refuses to fight it, which has been the case until now. Well, you know, Rabbi Hillel famously said, if I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? Religious Zionists, both Jews and Christians, are answering Reb Hillel's first question. Left liberals are answering his second question. Neither group is answering both questions. We have lived in exile for thousands of years. We're privileged to live at a time when our homeland has been restored to us. I guess we have to understand that Israel too may be under permanent siege, although I hate to think of that. But as members of a nation holy unto God, we must understand and never forget that ours is an eternal struggle, and we have so far been an eternal people. So.
Thank you so much. I'm going to thank both of the speakers for provocative, interesting, and certainly very educative presentations. So I'm going to, again, invite people to ask questions in the chat. I wanted to ask the first question that had to do with Hamas's purpose in weaponizing sexual atrocities. Did they do it because they believed that they could get away with it, and that the media would play it down, and they wouldn't be called out on it, and that was a way of, I think you said, plausible deniability, so that maybe Amy said it, so that they could disparage Israel's response? In other words, did they do it to try to get Israel to respond with a great deal of force, and on the reliance of the fact that the West wouldn't believe it, or not? Or did they do it because they wanted their own community to believe it, and it would increase their strength and popularity among their own followers? Or was it both?
I don't think that, I'm not privy to the internal discussions of Hamas, right? But I don't think that these are necessarily separate. And I do think that it was, pardon the expression, provocative on their part. And I do think after decades and decades and decades of the normalization of pornography, the fact that it's readily available online is entertaining, worked. And to the degree to which we're outraged, they win both ways. And you see this in the protests. They both, on the one hand, say when we come forward with evidence of what they've done, they call it Zionist propaganda, and yet they torture us and terrorize us by constantly saying that they will do it again and again. So it's all of those things combined, and I think for good people, and I think most people are good, I think for most people we find ourselves absolutely incredulous, and so it works even more. I don't know what you think, Phyllis, about that.
I think that good human beings have always had a trouble with evil, the concept of evil, the existence of evil. We would rather pretend that we're all good, but we're not all good. Others would rather pretend that we could do that ourselves, and I don't think that is at all true. I think what we're seeing psychologically is the projection of Islamic crimes onto Israel and onto Jews. And this is very typical for paranoid narcissists and for sociopaths and psychopaths. And how this came about and how it went viral and how it got picked up by the heirs to the post-Enlightenment values is really a question that remains to be answered. So we don't know how to, would rather look away from evil because it terrifies us and we don't comprehend it.
Right.
It's interesting that we had at DePaul has a Grace School of Applied Diplomacy, and we had some programs this spring featuring Arabs and Israelis who were trying to work together to reach some recognition of a path forward. And one of the Arab, both of them were tour guides. One of them, the Arab who lived in the West Bank, called out, used terms about genocide by an ethnic cleansing and so on. And somebody asked him, and I think that somebody was me, that those were buzzwords that kind of, irritated me. It was rasping terms because I thought they were inapt. And I asked what terms would Israelis use or Zionists use that would affect him in the same way. And his response was the claims of sexual atrocities, because they didn't happen. He didn't think they happened, and at least that was his position. And so that's why I wonder to what extent do you think that the Arabs, maybe not in Gaza, but in the West Bank, whether they believe it or they don't believe it. And that had to do with the question I had before about the media bias and the fact that they're protecting their sensitivities.
Most Arab Muslims on the West Bank, which was a British coinage, right? Yehuda and Shomron to us, and in Gaza, they listen to Al Jazeera, radicalized beyond belief. And they read Palestinian Islamic Jihad newsletters. And in any event, they're a captive population used as human shields. They cannot afford to say the truth, and that quickly leads to they can't think the truth. And they know that they'll be killed by Hamas or by the Palestinian Authority. If they dare to step out of line, there are some very, very brave exceptions. And I list a bunch of names, partly Daniel Pipes mentioned some, and I added some women's names of religious Muslim women who have stood for Israel recently and have stood against Jew hatred recently. But of course, the well-known names are Khaled Abu Tomer and Bassem Eid. And when Bassem came to visit me a while ago, I said, "How come you're still alive?" I said, "How powerful is your family?" And he said, "Powerful enough." So I suppose you need a lot of power to remain alive if you speak the truth or go against the party line among Arabs and among Muslims. And so I think it is possible that were the terrorist threat to be removed from Arab Muslims, whether it's in Iran or in Gaza, that they might indeed be open to other ideas, might be worth trying, don't know.
You mentioned Bassem Eid. I think he came to Chicago to speak at the University of Chicago, DePaul and Northwestern. When he was at the University of Chicago, he was greeted by many death threats in Arabic by members. It didn't have a pleasant trip at any of the stops. I think DePaul was the easiest for him. At Northwestern, he came out, saw some of the same people from University of Chicago, and he walked off the stage and didn't speak. So it is. But I just want to mention to you the question about deniability and it's traditionally anti-Semitism has been self-contradictory. You know, we're capitalists and we're communists, we're this and we're rich and we're poor and we're this and we're that, you know, cosmopolitan and narrow-minded. But with respect to sexual atrocities, you know, in 2007, there was a student at Hebrew University was awarded a prize by the university for writing a paper saying that the reason why the IDF soldiers don't rape Arab women is because they're racist and they think that the Arab women are not human, and so they don't rape them. And this was actually repeated this last week, I think in June 20th, an article by a writer from Haaretz. Journalist Nama Rebaz reported to have said basically that that the IDF soldiers don't rape Arab women due to racism, and on the other hand, you have allegations that they do engage in sexual atrocities towards Arab women. So you have this both sides, traditional classical. Double, internally inconsistent anti-Semitism. Sorry to have to have made that as a statement rather than a question, but the issue is this inconsistency. One of the people asked, "Do you have any remarks on how the apparent ignoring or cheering of sexual violence against Jews by Western non-Muslim supporters of Hamas is consistent with the modern leftist stance against sexual violence by men? Are they really against rape, or is it just they're against rape, but there's an exception for Jews?" I
think it's a brilliant question. I think it's an absolutely brilliant question. So first I would say that I saw something else in the chat. You know, the feminist movement emerged, as did the civil rights movement, not because the left was so great on issues of anti-racism and not because they were so great on issues of sexism. Quite the contrary. This is why so many folks turn to autonomous movements, right? So when we start thinking about the emergence of an autonomous feminist movement, it was in defiance of the chicks up front, or women say yes to men who say no against war. I think that one of the things that we're going to be seeing now as a result of this terror on women, if we cannot bring credible allegations of rape and sexual abuse in the aftermath of perhaps the most widely documented destruction of a people on October 7th, right? They filmed it. We have tremendous evidence. If we're not credible in bringing allegations of sexual abuse in that context, I can't imagine what it's going to be like, and I think our enemies know this, for women to credibly come forth under so-called peacetime or anywhere in the world. And I think that that's also what's really going on. I really do. So I thank you for that question. I think it's right on point.
Let me add another context. Rape in the United States is barely prosecuted. The Atlantic actually had a mind-blowing article last year in which over a 20-year period, the rape kits were not processed. They just sat on shelves. When a victim comes forward, they're put through so many legal loopholes. This is not wartime, and this is in the West. It's in the United States. And as I said before, rape is not seen as a hate crime, which it should be. It's rarely prosecuted, and the sentences are non-existent or minimal, with some exceptions depending on race, class. So why, and feminists who started out meaning well, I among them, I gave the keynote speech together with Florence Rush at the first ever conference on rape in 1971 in New York City. Well, guess what? We didn't abolish rape. Not here, not in New York City, not anywhere else. So people have already been desensitized, used to ho-hum, including the feminists who add to our work against violence against women, who've done nothing, who have moved on to anti-Black racism, colonialism, imperialism, reform of prisons, reconciliation, not punishment, empty the jails, don't charge the looters, the criminals, the lunatics on our streets. So, of course, if you then add to this indifference and disbelief or sympathy for the perpetrator, a lot of sympathy. He's a young man. You don't want to ruin his life. You know, he made one mistake, ways of thinking. So they did this bad thing on 10/7. Let's move on. Israel has occupied them. This is resistance. Of course, it makes sense that they would be using rape because they're just so angry. They were driven to it, as opposed to understanding that this was planned for many months, if not for many years, in Iran and funded by Iran. And my only anguished question is, A, how could the male commanders not listen to the women in the military who said they're breaking through our electronic fence? Go away, little girls, we don't want to hear from you. And how could the greatest counterintelligence operation in the world, in Israel, fail to make an accurate assessment? Yes, mowing the grass. Yes, keeping them mollified. Yes, paying them off to keep them away. How could Israel have made this mistake? I don't have the answer to the question, does anyone?
Similar to the question about how the leftist feminists dropped the ball with respect to abuses against Jewish women, is the complaint that, or the observation made by many, including Dumasani Washington, who is the head, he's a Black man who's the head of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, that the Arab Muslims, obviously we're not talking about all Islamic people, but we're talking about Arab Muslims in Sudan and Arab Muslims in parts of Africa are committing, first of all, engaging in slavery and engaging in race, in sexual assaults on Black women, and no one says anything about it. And instead, Black Lives Matter and many other Black leaders align themselves with Hamas. Why is that? And why does that work?
Amy.
I have to admit, I was just reading another question that came up. I missed the last part.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was really, how is it, just as leftist or feminist women have let Jewish women down, how is it that the Black community in America has seemed to completely let down the blacks worldwide. For example, the blacks in Sudan who are sold as slaves and who are attacked. And I mentioned, and in Africa, I mentioned Dumasami Washington, who's the head of Black Solidarity Institute of Black Solidarity with Israel, who speaks about this. How come the black community in America doesn't take up their causes?
All right.
So I think it's important to be brief with our answers because I'm seeing so many really great questions come in. I would say that a lot of it is that our educational system is broken. Our educational system is deeply broken, and that our students are largely, in general, ignorant about the world, our connections to it. And what's even happening now in our own country. So when you've got people getting their main sources of information through influencers on TikTok, it's very difficult to kind of break through with the kind of historical knowledge that, for example, Professor Chesler brings to the table. I don't think that this is just an issue of the African American community not knowing what's going on. I think that so many of us, including the Jewish community, does not know what's going on in terms of our politics or connection to Israel itself. So I would just say, in brief, this is a colossal warning sign about the fragility of our educational system.
Someone in the audience wants to know what can be done regarding Jewish people who criticize Israel and sympathize with Hamas.
Oh, wait, let me just say one thing.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Humanity is crooked at the root. I always say, well, what was God thinking? And is God weeping still over what we have become as a human species? So we should not be totally surprised by human beings of any color going with the flow, going with peer pressure. They don't want to lose their families, their friends, their jobs, their lives. So they just go with what is the herd point of view. And if that means indifference or towards their own people, towards injustice, well, then so be it. Some of us can't live with that, but most seem to be able to.
So the question that was asked, this question was, what can be done about the Jews who identify with Hamas, the Jews who sympathize with what happened on October 7th? What kind of community response is there other than education?
So first, I think education is absolutely essential. And I'm not going to say that 10%, around 10% is insignificant. I do think we have to focus on the ways in which an overwhelming percentage of the Jewish community knows better, and to continue to insist on that, right? And to derive strength from that. I don't know that it serves us to continue to focus on those folks that are a nemesis any more than it was useful to deal with all of the so-called feminists in support of pornography. But again, that's my take. I don't know what you think, Phyllis, on that.
Well, it's certainly not just feminists and it's not just Jews. Let's put it in perspective. I mean, it's the entire academy, the professoriate, as I said, international human rights organizations, the UN and their ICJ and their ICC setups, which have never, ever prevented a genocide, nor has it ever really reckoned with genocide. I mean, so again, failed humanity, corruption, greed. How do we deal with this? And it's the Jews. I mean, it's easy to say, well, listen, hey, Jews, if you're not standing for yourself, we're going to lose the third temple. We're going to lose the Jewish state. It's happened before. Sinat Hinam. What is wrong with you? And the answer is a little complicated and very simple. There's nothing wrong with them. They want to lead a good life. They want to be safe, and they want to be approved of. They want to be loved. They don't want to be bothered with the burden of Israel, the pariah state. They don't want to have to pay the price of being in the cognitive war for the truth. They just don't want to. So I don't think it's self-hatred. I think it's a desire to be okay.
Right. But maybe I think it's worth pointing out that people who behave like that, you know, all of the folks that engage in the kind of appeasement, the kinds of Jews that shout from the river to the sea, are the very people who are probably in the short term very much protected from the consequences of their ideas. In other words, if they want to be accepted into the cool group of kids, this seems to do it for them because they'll never really have to. It's a small price for them to pay, right? To be yelling that from the streets of New York for so-called peace as an admission to polite company. The fact of the matter is, and I think that you'd agree with me on this, I think you've probably said it yourself, Phyllis, that the people who behave like that are often on the front lines of being very harmed themselves when push comes to shove, right?
Being very
harmed, right?
Harmed.
They think that by becoming quislings, they'll be safe. And I think that they have made a tragic mistake.
So they're going to get into the gas chamber, but maybe third in line, not first. It's happened before. And, you know, let me ask a question. How do you account for or understand the Islamic style vulgarity being adopted with so many curses and such aggressive stances by the activists in the West? I mean, look at, well, what just happened outside the synagogue in Los Angeles is just one of so many examples. And all of the Columbia encampments, the college encampments, you have girls in keffiyehs and hijab who are vulgar, who are cursing, who are physically aggressive, who are adopting male body language. What is going on? How did
I think that they think that that's their ticket into being, quote, empowered.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Another person in the audience asks, we're seeing anti-colonialist thinking in gender studies, and anti-Zionism is used as the lightning rod for it. How can that be combated in the academy when the pushback is that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism? And then many of those leading the charge is saying that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism are Jewish.
Maybe they're more frightened than the rest of us. I think psychologically.
What do you think? You know, the notion that anti-Semitism, that all of what's going on in college campuses is all free speech, and that there's no way of limiting it because everything is free speech. We have incidences where people are teachers who make comments, terribly anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist comments. They're inaccurate, not just anti-Zionist, but inaccurate, and in their classroom, in a class that has nothing to do with the subject, political science or sociology, nothing to do with it, and yet they clamor that they have free speech and academic freedom. What's the answer to that?
Only where the Jews are concerned. If you did a KKK demonstration on a campus, you'd be out of there. If you started preaching Nazi eugenics, you'd be gone. Unless it was just against the Jews. We understand that this is a trick. And I began writing about this very early on in this century. The use of academic freedom and or free speech against the Jews, only against the Jews. How clever. Not against all of the other studies, the ethnic and gender studies, where it's sacred and sacrosanct. You can't use certain words. You have to only use other words. So this is clear Jew hatred. It's what it is.
Well, I disagree somewhat. I feel like I've been in this dog and pony show before. I'm reminded of the 1980s when many of us tried to speak publicly in an unmediated fashion, which I'm very glad that we have today, in an unmediated fashion about sexual abuse as it was documented through pornography. And the interesting thing was that a lot of a lot of women who identified themselves as feminists and insisted that we were out to ban people with whom we disagreed, as we were just trying to expose the horrendous nature of what now is called the sex industry. They went out of their way to cancel us. That term wasn't used back then. They effectively canceled us. They denied the extension of tenure to many. It was really, they really, in any way, they projected onto us what they had in mind to do to us, which was effectively silence us. I don't think it's coincidental, by the way, that many of the women who were engaged in the so-called sex wars, right, who insisted that we were out to deny them speech and then silenced us, those are the same folks that are out, just to bring this full circle back to Israel, are out to make sure that Zionists aren't on campus, that, you know, you can't have an Israeli scholar as a visiting scholar, that Jews can't be published unless we renounce our attachment to Israel, that they're the folks, actually, and we have to be clear about this, who are very much engaged in silencing us and denying our academic freedom. And same people, I have to say, Phyllis, you know this, same people from before. It was just the bondage, dominance, sadomasochism that they all venerated before. It became BDS version 2.
Yeah. Well, you know, but the canceling is also going on with a number of mass delusions. The transgender issue. J.K. Rowling can't say that there are biological, genetic, anatomical differences between men and women without being disinvited by her own team from the 20th anniversary party of the Harry Potter movie. And she's taken, and every radical feminist, radical lesbian feminist who has dissected and written brilliantly about the transgender issue and how it's the erasure of womankind that's going on is canceled. Absolutely canceled. So this is.
So what you're saying essentially.
Revolution. Go ahead.
Is that this notion of freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of thought is largely a mirage, right?
Well, so it's come to seem. Okay. Think of all the Muslim dissidents.
I do.
And they are killed, jailed, tortured, or live in exile, and also have to be protected by the FBI. So this is a very Islamic way of silencing thought as well as speech. And now it's infected the West.
What
like
another person in the audience says, to what extent can we view today's academics and higher education students as tools of terrorism? Today, the issue of faculty activism and student activism provides legitimacy to vulgarity and violence when it comes to Zionism. The notion of social justice advocated by these two cohort groups is the hallmark of, quote, end of scholarship, unquote. Today's increasing role of students has resulted in administrators bargaining with students, which permits the further dehumanization of Jews, Zionism, and Israel.
Well, it's like the toppling of the statues, the graffiti on Stonehenge. It's the youth revolt, if you will. It's the gibberish against authority that is also taking place.
Or I'm reminded of Neil Ferguson, who asks us to really be circumspect about what we refer to as higher education, which was that he said that that Germans were more likely to become Nazis if they, were coming from the academies. And I think that that's where we are now. And I think that that's what the person who issued that question and those very precise comments really underscores, that you're actually more inclined, and this is the tragedy of higher education right now, you're more likely to be anti-Semitic if you are in those halls with faculty like that. And that's a real shame.
in the Ivy Leagues, but again, it's bigger than just the academy, because the academy, generations of propaganda have turned the professors and the retired professors, as well as the current ones and their students, into these robotic beings who cannot think independently, who cannot think freely, who cannot think as individuals. And what's going to happen next? All this propaganda, all these activists acting out, they're going to start killing Jews, visible Jews. It's begun. And this is so much bigger than the era of the Shoah, because we are one world. We are connected via the internet, and it's very big and lethal lies. So everyone, everywhere is in on this now. And that's what we're seeing, this poisonous flowering as there's jihad against Israel. What can be the next step if not that? And what are we prepared to do about it? What are we getting ready to do about it?
Here we are.
I wondered long ago whether every Jewish citizen of every Western country would need an IDF patrol to protect them in the West. And now, what's going to happen in Israel as Hezbollah has been launching so many rockets and setting northern Israel on fire? Nobody cares about all the Israelis who've been displaced from the south and from the north.
But we do. And so I think we have to keep focusing on that, right? We do. Professor Reznikov's JLJS program, they do. We do. I completely understand your frustration. I am experiencing it as well. I would say that we can't afford to become completely overwhelmed. We've got to focus on the possibilities of surviving this and, in fact, thriving thereafter. We have to, because if we don't, we're done. We have to focus on those students in the classroom who are bright, those colleagues who are courageous, albeit there are a few of them. I mean, I'm no fool, but that's who we have to really focus on.
I agree. We also have to send money to Israel, to Zaka, to the IDF. We have to volunteer. We have to do everything we can do in our own little ways and in larger ways. I think the Jewish students who composed that letter at Columbia and got signatories for it, I reached out to them, and two came to visit. What were their requests? And they were very impressive. They were young Orthodox girls. They were very tiny, and they were very smart. So the first thing they asked was, would I come and speak on campus? I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And why not? We need you. I said, I'll think about it. And then they surprised me, because they said, we'd like to learn something true about feminism, but we can't at Barnard and we can't at Columbia. So could you teach us? I said, that I can do. And we'll see if they're serious, if they come back to me. I said, how many could everyone who you have in mind fit in my apartment? And they said, oh no, it would be more than that. But that's promising. So they were very young and exceedingly impressive and very pro-Israel. It was so refreshing. Can't forget to tell you. So I agree with what Amy just said.
Well, fortunately, Zoom technology is one of the things that can actually help you reach these people. So maybe you could think about. I know teaching in person is better, but
they don't want a Zoom lecture. They want me in person.
We find in a lot of Jewish organizations, as they say, the best is the enemy of the better. So we have to do what we can do rather than do nothing. But hopefully you'll find
I appreciate being able to Zoom in with you today. That's a kindness. That's merciful.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Somebody asked a question. It's a little bit off the topic, but I guess the topic has now been more globalized in terms of the different types of pressures and different types of ideologies that are a challenge. So the question is, do you believe the DEI, divestment, DEI is inherently anti-Semitic? It divides people into oppressed versus oppressor and labels Jewish people inexplicably as the oppressors. We ourselves, JLJS, has had a number of programs about DEI and about the anti-Semitic consequences of DEI and can they be combated? But what do you think about it?
In short, the answer is yes, but the textbooks on prejudice up until now, a very good series of studies documented that, guess what? Jew hatred, anti-Semitism is not included. So unless we begin to change the textbooks, what chance do we have in the academy?
How can we change the textbooks?
A lot of money, a lot of time. We're coming from behind.
The Canadian
could be done, has to be done.
Canadian teachers and Jewish teachers of social work tell me that many of the people who go into DEI programming as personnel are graduates of social work schools. And in the social work schools, as you say, it's not just the textbooks, the courses do not teach anti-Semitism. So the people are, even the good people of good faith are not at all sensitized to what anti-Semitism is and how to combat it. But I have no suggestions as to find the money to be able to change that.
A lot of lawsuits too, a lot of deep-pocketed lawsuits.
And under the lawsuits that are going on now with respect to anti-Semitism at college, I think James Tobin just wrote an article yesterday, I think, talking about how there's been a disappointment that even those that have found discrimination and found violations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have just, slapped colleges on the wrist, that there's really been no substantial consequences to them. So even the legal actions have really been futile at this point. Relatively so. Thus far.
Watch the Deborah Project, Lori Lowenthal Marcus, the curriculum in California. Look at Nitzana Darshan Leitner's work. There's a lot going on, but lawsuits take a long time.
Right. But, the Marcus suits in California have not, at least as of now, haven't quite been successful. The complaints and the amended complaints had been dismissed. I'm not sure what the current status is. I hope they're successful, but it's not been an easy story. But yes, you're right. That's certainly where the hope is, because that's where money could come from, and that's where change could be affected. But we have to focus on the K through 12 schools before they become just as bad as the colleges.
Yeah, begin at kindergarten.
So there's only a minute or two left, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to all the questions, but I just want to know if either of you or both of you have a last statement that you'd want to say.
We have to remain in the fight. We can't withdraw. And we have to be on the offensive, not the defensive, in every sense of the word. Certainly intellectually, academically, cognitively. But look, the IDF is on the offensive when it's allowed to be. I wish it was allowed more. It's a nightmare, America's foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran. Amy, what's the last thing you might want to say?
Well, I think that we have to be generous with one another. I don't think that we can afford to underestimate the toll that this has taken on our souls.
No.
Right? I mean, you're the psychologist, the PTSD that comes with the assaults on campus, that comes with the alienation. And at the same time, I go on again as I see those who are online, and some of them I know personally from other venues. We're talking about an extraordinary group of people who are generous and kind and brilliant. And I don't want to lose sight of that. So when we're down, a degree of generosity, a great degree of generosity, and most of all, an appreciation. And so I really thank you, Professor Resnikoff, for bringing us all together this afternoon.
You're very kind. Thank you for coming. And I just want to say one last thing. We do need a boost. We do need a some pep. And I think one thing that we fall down on sometimes because we're always on the defensive. I don't know that we have to be on the offensive all the time, but I think we should be proud of the accomplishments of the state of Israel and of the Jewish people. And I think that we should tell people about it and let them know about what the Jewish people have accomplished and what they've done for them, and what great advances in medicine and in all sorts of ways, how they benefit from the Jewish people being around. And I think that we should maybe organize a little bit more of a straight PR for that. And that'll be for our own good. And it might even reach many of the people who are really of good faith, but are ill-educated about the Middle East. And maybe that's a bright note to stop on. I want to thank you both for coming.
Google just invested a 10-year plan in a new building going up in Tel Aviv. That's interesting. That's good.
Okay. I'm not sure what the building's for. What's it for?
No, for their work. They're going to be working in Tel Aviv. Google.
Yes.
Yeah. They're not deterred by the moment at this moment in history. And, sometimes I think that all the people that are threatening to boycott Israeli geniuses, you know what? Don't send them the medicine. But if you do send it, charge them 3 times as much as a war tax. Think creatively about all of this.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks everybody for coming today. We do hope to have this recording available. We'll see. And when we do, we'll let you know and you can tell your friends. Bye-bye.
Thank you.